Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me, including the people who are joining us online. My name is Surya Dev. I'm the director of the B&HR Access to Justice Lab, as well as the Center for Environmental Law. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this Macquarie University land, the Awala-Matukal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures have nurtured this land for many centuries. I also pay my respect to elders, past and present. So it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome a visiting scholar who is from Slovenia, Professor Jernej, who is a professor of human rights law at the Faculty of Government and European Studies at Nova University in Slovenia. Jernej will talk about the prospects of the UN Loss and Damage Fund between Utopia and reality. So Jernej, you have the floor. Thank you very much once again for being with us. And we look forward to hearing from you. And after Jernej makes his presentation, there'll be time for questions and comments, both from those people who are in the room as well as online. Thank you everyone for joining. Can someone online confirm if you can hear us? By chat?
Yeah, somebody.
Okay.
Around.
All right. That's very good.
Yeah.
You just want to be sure. Thank you. Jernej, floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Jernej Černič. I'm a professor, as Surya mentioned, in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, at Nova Univerza. And today I'll make a short talk on the UN Loss and Damage Climate Change Fund. And I will try to look at the recently established fund from a critical perspective. As some of you may know, the fund is in early stages. It was established in 2022. But this research and this talk is a part of my wider project on climate change, corporate accountability, and human rights, which is funded by the Slovenian Research and Innovation Agency. And the aim of this project, under which I'm also here at Macquarie, here in Sydney, is to develop a normative model for corporate accountability for negative impacts of climate change on human rights. Now, when we talk about climate change and the Loss and Damage Fund, okay, perfect. Of course, the fund aims to address the negative impacts that climate change causes globally, both in global south and global north. And on the first slide, I want to start my talk with the natural disaster, which happened a couple months ago in early November 2024 in Valencia, in wider region of Valencia in Spain, where local population experienced really catastrophic floods. Over 220 lives were lost. At the moment, the estimated damage of the floods is around 20 billion euros. This is only damage caused directly by the floods. The losses are not yet reported, probably in a similar amount. And this is an example of a disaster which totally upends the socioeconomic livelihoods in a country. You know, it directly interferes with daily lives of local population and will subject them to difficulties in many years to come. And as it's often seen in Spain, it was not an exception here. When the natural disaster happened, when climate change disaster happened, there is often, thereafter a blame game between different levels of state administration. Who is responsible that these floods or fires or any other climate change disaster happen? And unfortunately, this happened and it's still ongoing in Spain between the regional government and the central government, which are of different political ideology. But I wanted to start with this slide because, of course, when the climate change disaster happens in global north, then there are already some mechanisms in place which can remedy, the negative impacts of climate change. And there are some mechanisms which can, respond to loss and damage which the country and individuals suffer. In this case, there are several mechanisms under the Spanish state authorities, and there is also EU Solidarity Fund, EU Resilience Fund, which can, at least in the short term, address the damages and losses. Of course, not all losses and damages will be able to be covered. No, but then when we talk about climate change disasters in global south, there is often lack of normative framework, lack of adequate responses which could efficiently respond to negative impacts of climate change if floods happen in a country which is not as developed as Spain, which is a global north country, member of OECD, relatively developed country, and still has difficulties. Can you imagine this happening as several years ago happened in Pakistan? Still, population is struggling, the state is struggling to respond. And in my talk today, I'll basically try to answer 5 questions, or we can also later talk about them in discussion. First, I'll ask myself, what are the rights holders and duty holders of a UN loss and damage fund? What is legal scope and nature? Is there a legal obligation to contribute to the UN loss and damage fund? Is the aim preventive, or is mostly to compensate most affected states for losses and damages? And then sometimes we also hear these discussions both at COP but also beyond COP. Is it necessary for the fund to have credibility and legitimacy to ensure equality in assisting countries affected by negative impacts of climate change in all parts of the world, not only in global south, but also in global north? And what should be the overreaching governing principles of the fund? Just to give you some background on the fund, which is new institution, is basically in establishment just now, establishing in the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, basically to address negative impacts of climate change. Of course, the fund uses the concept of loss and damage. This is a concept which was introduced by Paris Agreement on Climate Change in Article 8, and this is a concept which differs perhaps with more known concept in climate change, mitigation and adaptation, for negative impacts of climate change. And basically, it was established with wide support from states, from global south and global north. I think this should be clear at the beginning, that also global north states supported the establishment of loss and damage fund. And it's based on a shared and joint responsibility for negative consequences of climate change. And its aim is basically to prevent or to compensate most affected states for losses and damages. Now, when we look at the objectives of the fund, you will see that the aim of the fund is basically to assist developing countries, i.e. countries from global south, to respond to vulnerable effects or to adverse effects of climate change, and to respond to economic and non-economic loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change. Here we should know that this concept of loss and damage lacks definitive, explanation or definition. There is no binding definition on loss and damage, but nonetheless, when we talk about economic losses, we talk about destruction, deterioration of infrastructure, of houses, and when we talk about non-economic losses, we talk about negative impacts on cultural heritage, human dignity, biodiversity. And basically, the aim of the fund is to collect funds, mostly from global north, and then to allocate them to the most vulnerable countries, most affected countries by the climate change. Recently, at COP29 in Baku, a couple months ago, countries agreed that countries of global north agreed that they will contribute $300 billion by 2035. No mistake. It's a quite high-flying stake in the final declaration. Obviously, it's a not binding declaration, but still, it's a commitment which is quite a lot. It's a commitment which perhaps nowadays it seems far away in the clouds, because nowadays in December 24, the fund received so far only $741 million. So, for example, Australia so far pledged 31 million, Slovenia 1.5 million. The fund as such will be financially administered by a World Bank for the period of 4 years, initial period of 4 years. So you can see there is a quite discrepancy between the commitments in Baku and then real pledges by the countries. So far, only countries from global north contributed to the fund. Now, when we talk about the fund, there are often dilemmas who are rights holders under fund. Of course, this is very early days when we talk about rights holders. Of course, obviously states. The question, which I'll come also later to it, is which states? Okay, if we say global south states, the developing states, but which developing states, which global south states? Because even in global south, there are some countries which are heavy polluters, heavy, emitters of emissions. But then civil society is a civil society also rights holder. There are a lot of dilemmas whether civil society will be permitted to participate in the functioning of the fund, in the board meetings. There was a lot of controversy about right of civil society to participate in the first board meetings. They were denied at first to participate. Then community groups. Will community groups be able to apply directly to the fund, or the funds will be directly administered to the state? Obviously, in many countries there are a lot of rule of law challenges. When you administer the funds directly to the state authorities. Then are rights holders bilateral, multilateral donors? Could they also apply for funding, which can then direct to countries? What about individuals directly? Can an individual will be able to apply directly for funding? A lot of vagueness in this regard will be able to apply to the fund. Now, duty holders here in the meaning of states which have obligations to contribute the funds to the fund. Mostly, they global north states. They should contribute. Also, the decision to establish the fund recognizes that global north states should contribute. International organizations could be another duty holder. Multilateral, bilateral donors. Businesses. I'll come later to private finance, whether businesses have obligations. Then the question of wealthiest persons. Many of experts in the field have argued for tax on the most wealthy, and then also ordinary individuals which can also contribute. The fund has also a bracket of web page where everyone can contribute, can make a donation to the functioning of the fund. Now, so far, a number of challenges can be identified in the working of the UN loss and damage fund. One already mentioned, insufficient and delayed funding. Pledges which were made years ago were not met yet. Then the question about governance and rule of issues, how the fund will be governed in the beginning. Nowadays, developed countries have minority of members in the board of the fund. Majority goes to the global south countries. And just now, when you look at the page of the UN Loss and Damage Fund, you will see that the fund is trying to make these first steps to ensure that there will not be any conflict of interest, that rule of law will be respected. Also, the heads of different divisions of the fund were elected through the merit-based selection system. So these are efforts which were the states are trying to make the fund work. And then there are also a lot of ambiguities, implementation details, and selection criteria. I'll come in a second to that. And deficient non-state actor participation, decision making, which I mentioned already. And there's a lot of red tape and risk aversion. If you look at the decisions which were made in the last weeks or last months by the board, most of those decisions concern the daily business of the fund, travel policy, salaries, where the fund will be held next board meeting. So a lot of operational issues, not much about the essence of the fund itself, how to allocate the fund. And here, Surya, I think you mentioned in your report, you mentioned at some point, you mentioned that it's important to start right in the right way. So this is very important that the fund does not lose itself in this formal or bureaucratic methods, which of course are necessary for any organization to start, but nonetheless, this should not be the priority of the fund. Now, there is not much already decided about selection and assessment criteria, about how the funds will be allocated, to which countries or to which rights holders will be allocated. And there's a lot of dilemma we can maybe discuss in the debate about that. Who should be, given the funds, which countries vulnerable or those who have the least resources. But then, if you agree on vulnerability, how do we define vulnerability? Which countries are most vulnerable due to climate change? How do we decide that? Are historic injustices should be criteria, or emissions, or GDP of a country, or capacity of the country at domestic level to adapt and mitigate adverse effects of climate change. For example, the criteria could be whether the country has systems in place to measure loss and damage. Then, of course, even among those countries, the questions arise: whom to prioritize, to which country to give priority. And then there are more hard questions about some countries which some decades ago were definitely among global south countries. They were developing countries, but some countries made huge progress in the last decades, like China. Is a China global south country? Should China be a rights holder or duty holder? I would argue here that China should be a duty holder, has obligation to contribute to the fund. And also Brazil, perhaps. India, perhaps, is not yet there. Is still considered developing global south country. Doesn't have obligation. But then, of course, also concerning India, for example, when we talk about private sector, there's a lot of large corporations, large businesses in India, which could contribute to the functioning of the fund. And then the question is also who sits on the board of the fund. Nowadays, they are representatives of the state, but I would argue here that also civil society should have a seat on a board. And then the question also about, which is quite critical in my mind, who are those persons who sit on the board of the fund? Are there any criteria concerning their integrity, independence, impartiality, fairness? Have those persons gone through any vetting processes? I think it's quite important to make sure at the beginning that those persons who will decide about allocation of the funds in the later stage are individuals with integrity and that they act in a transparent way. Otherwise, the fund can quite quickly lose itself in this ideological division between global south and global north, as it was already the case in the last decades from the creation of non-aligned movement in the 60s. Then the question is also, how should countries access the funds? Should the countries access the funds directly or indirectly? Some other climate change finance mechanisms, they have established accreditation processes where countries have to be accredited to directly access the funds, such as Global Finance Fund has a very rigorous accreditation processes which the countries have to comply with in order to get direct access to the funds. So there's a lot of vagueness concerning this. And then, of course, also the difficult, hard question concerning the fund is the question about complementarity. What is the added value of UN climate change loss and damage fund? To already, comparing to already existing mechanisms. Particularly here, the question would be, what is its complementarity with the Global Climate Fund, which administers and allocates a lot of climate finance. Probably is the largest donor in this regard. Will at some point UN Loss and Damage Fund incorporate climate change fund, Global Climate Fund, or there will be a competition? Will the UN Loss and Damage Fund have similar assessment selection procedures? Obviously, it would be good to take away good practices from already existing mechanisms, and apply them in the loss and damage fund. And then, of course, a very difficult question is, will it have different means of funding beyond state funding? Nowadays, only states have contributed to the UN Loss and Damage Fund, around 20-30 states from global north. But as it seems, this will not be enough. The pledges are not met, and we have to look for other finances. We have to look to alternative funding, particularly in private finance, in private sector. And here, there are many different ways one can go about alternative funding. One proposal which has been ongoing for many years is imposition of global tax, global wealth tax on the richest persons, carbon taxes, and so on. There are some other mechanisms which use carbon swaps or nature debt swaps, donations, and also billionaire pledges, as giving pledge by Bill Gates and Gates Foundation. Of course, those are only pledges. They are voluntary, they're not binding, and the fund will have to look also for their means, perhaps to create a legal obligations from private sector in order to raise funds for the fund. because it's easy to make these high promises as they were made in Baku a couple months ago, about $300 billion, whereas we are at less than 1% of pledges completed. But definitely, if you look at, if you go now back to this macro picture, whether the fund is necessary, there are arguments, very convincing, persuasive arguments that the fund is necessary, particularly in order, to ensure climate justice and protection of rights holders and to support the most vulnerable rights holders in nations. Definitely, natural disasters happen also globally, as we see these days here in Australia. So many floods in different parts of Australia, so many floods last year in Europe, fires and so on. But those countries are more resilient to address the negative impacts of climate change, and more resilient to support rights holders. And also, one can also make this historical argument, which we often hear at COPs meetings, that global north countries have historical obligation, to help to assist global south countries, because global north countries have historically emitted very high amounts of emission, and global south countries not, and that's why they should, through global justice, solidarity, compensate global south countries. But then there also, we should not dismiss arguments which some scholars, commentators raise against the fund. Perhaps one argument which is often heard is that there is no clear criteria yet how the funds will be distributed. There is no added value to existing mechanisms, no effective supervision, non-binding as well. Some commentators also say that there is no legal obligation for global north countries to contribute to the fund, that we are voluntary area, and that there is a lack of focus on prevention. So there, even when one argues for the creation and functioning of the fund, one has to be aware of different arguments against the fund. Now, there are some dilemmas which I want to raise here. Perhaps the question which occupies me quite a lot is, will the sustainability of the nations beyond global north countries be ensured? For sustainability of the fund would be also quite welcome that the fund also receives contributions and donations from parts of global south, which are, at least medium developed, in order to convince also global north countries to contribute more. And then also the question which is often raised in discussions on climate change, how this causality between attribution between the cause and adverse impacts of climate change will be established, and how can be determined. This is quite, still under discussion. And perhaps, when we talk about UN Loss and Damage Fund, we concentrate on donations, on contributions by global north states. Perhaps the fund can also explore, the board can explore to create more non-financial capacity and incentives for countries to rebuild themselves and to help vulnerable communities to address negative impacts of climate change. And then it's very important to ensure so stable funding. And here again, I repeat, it's crucial for the fund to ensure that rule of law, transparency, oversight, integrity are complied with. and that equal treatment and non-discrimination is ensured both concerning rights holders and also duty holders all the time, and that countries commit long term. One of the challenges the fund will be to ensure longevity of contributions. It's quite easy for Australia, Slovenia to contribute a certain amount this year or last year, but then nobody can guarantee what happens if the government changes here in Australia in a couple of months, or in Slovenia next year. Perhaps those governments will be less likely to contribute. We know that Australia has some years ago withdrawn itself from a global climate fund due to the issues concerning rule of law, transparency, and oversight of that fund. And those are valid concerns which countries have, and that's why it's really necessary for the fund to make sure that equal treatment rule of law is ensured. Then, of course, when funds are given by donors or funders, it's also quite important to ensure access to remedy for individuals which have been affected by funds given by the fund. Like World Bank already has some mechanisms in place, such as ombudsman mechanism, and also international financial institutions have access to remedy in place, and the fund should ensure that the right holders, individuals, have access to remedy, and also that people who make decisions in the fund, particularly the board members, are held accountable for their action. This is quite important for new institutions to ensure. And then what is really important, and what we should emphasize, is that we should not try to undermine the establishment of the fund in ideological disputes between Global South and Global North, which is often seen at COP meetings. Also in the last COP29 meetings, there was a lot of bickering between Global South and Global North. And one way to ensure is that the UN and the board members create a robust institution, strong institution, which will enjoy confidence and trust of stakeholders, and also rights holders and duty holders, and to ensure independence, impartiality, integrity, and which, of course, will be a challenge in the UN system. There are so many challenges concerning integrity, transparency, impartiality, but in my opinion, this is crucial for a fund to have a chance to succeed in the next years, in the next decade. Now, coming to a close of my talk, one way to look at the fund is basically to welcome it as a good attempt to respond to harmful effects of climate change on countries in both Global South and Global North, but to ensure that fund will have longevity and stable funding in the future. This is necessary to make clear what is structure, what are its legal underpinnings, what is the content obligations, what are the selection criteria, allocation criteria, who are duty holders, and also to define objectives and expected result. I think it's quite necessary that the fund should put in place a number of different indicators where both academia and civil society could measure the success of the fund. Of course, measuring human rights has its difficulties, but nonetheless, it's quite necessary to ensure the credibility and legitimacy for the fund. And then, as I said, it's necessary to ensure accountability of different stakeholders and access to remedy. In conclusion, the idea of UN loss and damage fund is necessary and is convincing, but in order for a fund to succeed, a clear structure, clear obligations, and clear criteria have to be defined so that the fund enjoys credibility and legitimacy, and particularly trust of the stakeholders. And we all know that in the climate change, there's a lot of stake, from ordinary people, suffering in their livelihoods, to global South countries here, very close to here in Pacific, so many different challenges. And that's why we should not let this fund gets lost in these operational issues and rule of law issues. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jernej, for dealing with a highly complex issue with so many dimensions and variables. And of course, probably we need multiple seminars or a full-day conference to unpack fully any of these issues. But now we have some time for any questions, comments, any reflections that anyone may have. We'll start with the people in the room, and then we'll turn to people who are online.
I had one probably brief question. Yeah, thanks very much. That's really interesting. So I'm assuming from what you said, they haven't distributed any money yet. Is that right? When do they plan to, and what's sort of going on with that, when they might actually distribute to a group or a country? Yeah.
There's no time
But
frame.
before we go there, I just want to check if the participants online could hear the question posed. Otherwise, we need to.
I come over there.
Yeah, otherwise we need to come here. Let's see if you could hear the question as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. It seems then the microphone can pick. So that's fine then. Maybe Jernej, you can come here, and then people can ask questions, and then we'll take the questions online as well.
I mean, the fund is in very early stages, so there is no time frame for that. The fund is now, I mean, the secretary of the fund is now busy setting up the office, and all these necessary policies. So hopefully in the next couple of years, will be necessary. But hopefully also the money which was pledged so far will not be spent only for on these administrative issues. Yeah.
Can I just ask a tiny follow-up? I know you talked a lot about sort of how they might distribute the money, but I'm wondering, I suppose, is there any sort of decision made or policy on, is it more to do with immediate disasters or more to do with long-term funding for whatever kind of issue that might be? Is there a...
There's no distinction. Yeah, I would argue that both set of scenarios come into play, both immediate responses, but also long-term. For example, in EU, there's a similar mechanism called EU Solidarity Fund, which functions very quickly. Just immediately after the Valencia floods in November last year, in a couple of days, the Solidarity Fund already allocated. I think initially it was like 500 million euros to the Spanish government, and then in the ensuing week another billion. And so this fund should function in a similar way, very quickly, very efficiently. Otherwise, if you get lost in bureaucratic decision making, then the purpose of the fund would be lost.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan. And I also find it very interesting. And I have a question about the application scope of this fund. For example, other than the right holders and duty holders, what kind of disasters or damage should be included by this fund? For example, I wonder whether how can we identify this damage is a climate change caused damage, and is there a role for the science to play in deciding this kind of disasters?
It's a very good question. The concept of loss of damage is not clearly defined, so it's up to discussion and up to authoritative interpretation by decision makers. The fund could also provide guidance in this respect, Obviously, the fund addresses both economic and non-economic losses and damages. Particularly when we talk about non-economic losses, the concept is very vague. It could be also, in this bracket, one could follow gender equality, also protection of the human rights defenders, which were directly affected by the climate change. So yeah, it's very broad. I would argue for very broad definition. No, not for narrow definition. But then, of course, there are other challenges if the fund applies very broad definition. Then anything could be damage and loss. But most, concerning economic damage, what comes in mind is like loss of houses, reconstruction efforts, reconstruction of infrastructure, and so on. Yeah.
But in my mind, even like for natural disasters, I don't feel like they are all caused by climate change. Even before we pay attention to the issue of climate change, there are many kind of natural disasters happening in the world.
Right. I mean, if you look at this disaster in Spain last year, but also in Slovenia in August 2023, a lot of damage and losses which was suffered by those two countries was mainly consequence of lack of adaptation and mitigation measures adopted by countries. Because, for example, in Valencia, the river which flooded, which was not made deep enough in order to prevent the most dire effects of floods in Slovenia. In the same way, in Spain, for example, the municipalities in this image, which I have the first slide in Porta, granted like construction licenses in the area which technicians already identified as a risk of floods. So it's very much connected to the question. There is a lack of vision of adopting mitigation and adaptation measures. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, this is an eternal discussion, no? What was caused by climate change and what was not caused by climate change? Because yes, you're right, natural disasters happen, but of course, this UN Loss and Damage Fund should not, in my opinion, deal or go into this, ideological debates whether the floods were caused, by climate change or not. In Valencia, there's a lot of evidence that they were caused by climate change because of high temperatures, which then affected the temperature of the sea, Mediterranean Sea, which in turn caused heavy rainfalls, which then caused the floods. But the objective of the fund should be to provide efficient mechanisms to respond to climate change or natural disasters. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. I want to also check online, if you don't mind.
Comment in the chat.
There's one.
If there are any questions, I think no questions, it seems. But I see a couple of participants online. So if you have any questions, please unmute yourself or put your question in the chat, because we want to give you the opportunity as well to ask any questions. Are there any questions from the online participants?
I want to ask a question.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Nusrat, do you have a question? Because it seems
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor, for your nice presentation. I have a basic question about how do you conceptualize the feature of additionality in terms of climate finance? How do you feature additionality in the loss and damage funds funding or finance mobilization? What do you think that it should be separated from the ODA finance 0.7%? How do you think about it, that the finance from Global North in the loss and damage fund, how it should be conceptualized, how it should be new and additional? Thank you so much.
conditionality.
Jernej, I think the question is that there is a lot of discussion about that the funding that will be given by states to this fund, it could be merely diverted from the existing funding, which is part of ODA or the funding
Yes.
meant for adaptation and mitigation. So how do we ensure that the funding for this fund is new and additional? It's not merely repackaging of the existing funding. I understand that is the question.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier about complementarity of the fund to the existing adaptation mitigation mechanisms, both at multilateral, bilateral level. I mean, one way, particularly when we look at the declaration on COP29 is to argue that UN loss and damage fund is additional layer, of obligations of states to compensate for loss and damage due to climate change. And to do that, I mean, it's quite challenging, but still we could argue that there is emerging legal obligations that states from global north should contribute to the fund in order to compensate those countries due to numerous reasons which we already mentioned today. But that, of course, is it's an argument which is not widely accepted by global north states at the moment. States would not say that this is a legal obligation, but nonetheless, in academia, we often try to think a couple decades in front, and there is an argument that also states have obligations which is based on legal sources which are already there, or they're emerging, or can be indirectly derived from international agreements or domestic constitutional systems. Last year, for example, a group of academics adopted Maastricht principles on the rights of future generations, which go in this way to argue that these funds should be additional to what is already there. But Gustav, your question is, yeah, it's a very smart one, because nowadays there is about $20 billion annually available for loss and damage through climate change, through different mechanisms, either bilateral and multilateral. No? And yeah, it's a challenge to argue and to convince the states, particularly in the global economic environment we are just now. Particularly in Europe, economy is going down. States have to tighten their budgets and households, and yeah, the challenge to argue that. I would argue that there is an emerging legal obligation. And this argument perhaps can help us to argue that states have additional obligations to contribute to the fund apart from what they already contribute through different mechanisms.
Thank you. I think you can take your question now.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to say that, I mean, I think a lot of attention needs to be paid to how the money is going to be spent. And I don't know how much that is happening. Is that happening about like when the money does materialize and go to the global south? I come from Nepal originally, which is in the global south, and sometimes when money gets taken to these countries, they just get fitted into different political agendas, So what is the money going to be used for? Is it for relief aid? Is it for building that resilient infrastructure, or building the capacity of the government, or actually for, there's a lot of discussion on that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is not much discussion on that. I mean, mostly policy documents, with few exceptions, nowadays concentrate on this obligation to contribute to the fund, but not how the funds will be allocated. And you're right. I think there are some criteria which should be complied with, such as you said, capacity, rule of law environment, participation of civil society, oversight by different stakeholders, both domestic but also global. All these challenges which we often see in development aid, which are there since decades. How to ensure that the aid really comes to the rights holders. This will be the challenges in the functioning of the fund. Beyond the pledges. Once the pledges will be completed, hopefully, those will be the challenges, and that's why I put so much emphasis in my talk on the issues of integrity and transparency of the fund. It's otherwise, often in weak rule of law environments, there's a lot of risks that money goes sideways or gets lost. And here, UN and UN Loss and Damage Fund can resort to the expertise of various UN agencies which do development aid since decades, like UNDP. They have very strict criteria and oversight mechanisms how the money is spent, and it's really essential. The fund does not start from scratch, but it takes away also good practices from other UN agencies about oversight.
It's also interesting to think about the idea about how this concepts of loss and damage globally can also expand the ideas of concepts of humanitarian aid,
Yeah.
I mean, with recently Trump's order to stop US aid,
Yeah.
These kind of things can add new dimensions. Like development at one time actually morphed into sustainable development, development aid. And now maybe these kind of concepts of loss and damage can expand those concepts of humanitarian and normative values, globally, responsibility. And that's also an interesting, I think, sort of area to sort of think about and discuss,
Yeah.
expanding the ideas of responsibility and ethics and of normative values.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's so important to have a fund as a strong institution, which will be able to allocate the funds and which will be able to build on the work other UN agencies already done in the past. Yeah. But I mean, it's often difficult, particularly in Europe, when you listen to commentators, if you ask ordinary rights holders in Europe, most of them, they would be against the establishment of the loss and damage fund. Particularly nowadays in the environment, they would say, well, why should we in Germany or France, our economy is going downways. Why should we contribute to a fund which we don't know who will administer the funds and so on. But in my opinion, we should not concentrate merely on these ideological issues. We should defend the idea of the fund, but then also to make sure that the fund does not lose itself in usual challenges which UN agencies face, from transparency, impartiality, rule of law, and so on. Yeah, and this will be a challenge, particularly if you have time. You can look at the webpage of the fund. There's so many different decisions every day about, how the funds will be spent for administrative stuff. There's a lot of, decisions where the meetings of the fund will be held this year. I think the next meeting is in Barbados, Bahamas. I'm not sure why it's necessary to have a meeting in Barbados with the board. Yeah, so this kind of questions, which, I mean, I would argue that governments in global north would be more likely to contribute funds if the fund will start, modestly, and concentrate, on the core of its mission, not to, lose itself in the travels around the world.
Okay, I mean, I have several questions, but in the interest of time, I will only ask one. But before I ask the question, I can explain the Barbados, Bahamas meeting, because several states had applied that they would like to host the fund. So Manila, it is going to be based in Manila. So the Philippines got the approval, but the Bahamas was the other country that had made a bid. And some of these countries are highly exposed to climate change related loss and damage. So I think definitely it incurs expenses, but it also allows the board to see the ground reality. Because sometimes if the board members do not see what is happening on the ground, they don't see it. Anyway, so the question that I have is that you talked about rights holders and duty bearers. And I got the impression that you're talking about them as separate. There are certain states which may be the duty bearers, and certain states could be the right holders. But I'm thinking that can there be a duality of concept that all states have an obligation to contribute to the fund to a different level? So we can apply a proportionality test. And then not many, but not several states would have also a possibility to tap into the fund because it's a collective fund, right? And I think that also becomes relevant because we talk about the concept of a developing country, but the difficulty is we don't have a UN definition of who is a developing country. So that creates the challenge. And I think you hinted about it. Should China be regarded as a developing country? China claims, of course, it's a developing country, but so where do we go from there? I don't know if you have any reflections on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that objective of the fund is to assist developing countries. So probably the rights holders of the fund are those countries in global south which are most in need, most affected by climate change, which is in a way, from the point of view of the UN Charter system, is a controversial proposition. Just remember the main principle of the UN Charter, sovereign and equality of the states. All states are equal, have the same rights, obligations under the UN system. But putting this to aside, concerning duty bearers, I would definitely argue that all states have obligation to contribute to the fund. But when you look at the minutes of the COP meetings, both from 27, 28, and 29, there is a growing consensus among state parties that only a certain group of states has obligation to contribute. And this is those are 50, 60 states in global north, and then some states maybe in global south. In this case, China or Brazil or Indonesia, do they have this obligation? And this is, in my opinion, this is quite a dangerous development, because then you undermine the functioning of the fund. You basically exclude 2/3 of UN state parties from obligation to contribute to the fund. And by itself, you undermine the fund, and then you place this fund in a certain ideological position. And that UN Loss and Damage Fund is a fund for North to compensate the South on the basis of criteria which have not been published so far. Because if you compare UN Loss and Damage Fund and Global Finance Climate Fund, which has criteria, their criteria are very strict and clear. How the funds will be allocated. Here, the fund is, at least in the beginning, in other stages, is lost in this argument. This is quite dangerous for its credibility and legitimacy. If global North states will feel that they are put, in the corner where they have to pay, we are back, to non-aligned movement where Tito, Nero, and the former Indonesian dictator decided, decided that they will make a coalition against the bad guys from global. And I don't think this is the point of the UN Loss and Damage Fund. It's a good idea, it's a convincing argument, but of course it was constructed in realities of international communities. It stands now. And that's why so many states from Europe, also from this region, Australia, have so many, have so many criticisms towards the fund. What do you think about that? I mean, who has obligation?
I think definitely all states could, in principle, have obligations, but I think we cannot also ignore the historical polluters, right? Whether these are states or companies or even wealthy individuals. I mean, they have to definitely bear most of the obligations in terms of contributions, as far as I'm concerned, because that will be climate justice.
Particularly private companies, I would say,
Yeah.
extractive industry companies.
Yeah. Fossil fuel, for instance. I mean, they have made billions of dollars over the years.
Still making.
Still making. So I think definitely they would have to do that. I mean, in the interest of time, I think we should just wrap it up for now. But thank you very much, Jernej, once again for finding time to visit us. First of all, Macquarie University, and also sharing your thoughts about this ongoing issue. And we look forward to engaging on this issue and with you in the near future. Thank you, everyone, also for coming and engaging with this issue.
Thank you very much. Good.
Thanks.